Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. My name is Carlos Orenco. I'm a BI specialist with the Customer Experience Group, and today I'm going to be sharing some insights into the SAP BI sizing and virtualization. The agenda for today will be, we're going to be talking about building better BI systems and developing a strategy for sizing. We're going to be looking into more details about the sizing of BI environments. We'll be covering testing and tuning the environment, and we'll be finalizing with the architecture of virtual environments as well. And we're going to wrap up with key learning points about the presentation. So let's start by talking some of the SAP BI considerations for sizing. The BI environment is very I/O intensive, and it does have quite a bit of stress on I/O because of report refreshing, data retrieval, and data transferring. An important thing to consider here is that sometimes it's really difficult to measure the amount of I/O in the environment. The systems have to be configured to accommodate spike loads as opposed to simply average loads in your system. It's important to understand as well that the BI is designed to consume all resources in the system, such as CPU, memory, file system, and I/O. And some restrictions outside the environment can constrain that ability, such as deficiencies in your LAM, the quality of services in general, storing, tiering, etc. How do you develop a strategy for SAP BI sizing? First and foremost, you have to start using the Sizing Estimator. You have to start using the Sizing. Sizing Estimator. Basically, as you most likely are familiar with Sizing Estimator in previous versions, it's the online tool that allows you to have the initial sizing of your environment. In addition to that, there's a big friend of yours, which is the SAP Sizing Guide. This document has all the references for all the processes in the system and what their limits are in terms of usage, concurrency, and resources usage on the environment. It's important to notice that the SAP CMS database is a key component of your performance and will dictate how the system will perform. So making sure that SAP CMS repository is in well shape, it's a very good idea. Another step that you have to keep in mind is that you have to gradually scale out your environment. Don't start your system with 1,000 users right up front. Start small and then gradually scale it up for the users in your system. And most importantly, constantly test, collect results, analyze those results, and reiterate the same process so that you constantly know what your system needs, what it's been the average load in the environment, and what you need to do to accommodate peak loads. In addition to that, in order to find where you can locate the BI Sizing Estimator and the Sizing Guide, I've just added the link here from the SCN. Some of the considerations about BI4X. BI4X is a full-blown 64-bit environment, which is different from previous version of business intelligence. BI is designed to take full advantage of 64-bit, which gives us a lot more flexibility for memory addressing, and allows the systems to utilize a lot more memory, which is actually a good thing because it makes the system a lot more flexible and robust. BI 4.0 is actually completely different from previous versions such as BI 3.1. An example of that is that BI 3.1 used to be a collection of processes, all with on connectivity stack, whereas BI 4 has several processes spread through the cluster and utilize a common semantic layer for data connectivity. You will notice that BI 4 has a bigger footprint on the system. However, it is more flexible, it is more robust, and it performs a lot better than the previous versions. What do you need to do to make sure that you have a decent sizing exercise in place? Well, it's important to understand that the sizing of each service, I mean the process itself, needs to be accomplished. Each process individually needs to be considered and needs to be configured for optimum performance. You need to keep in mind where in your cluster you will keep the processes and how many processes you will add to the environment. In addition to BI 4, different from BI 3.1 is the adaptive processing service. This service is different from any other service because it hosts multiple different services in the cluster. There's a very interesting white paper at SCN that talks about best practices on how to configure the APS. I just added the link for your reference. What is new about the APS? When you install BI Enterprise in your environment, you're going to have one APS by default on the system. And this will allow you to get up and running immediately. This configuration is well suited for development systems, test, and trial environments. However, it is not suited for production. In a production environment, you do have to go through the entire sizer exercise. You do have to configure the APS processes, and most likely, you have to create additional APS to be dedicated for certain services in your cluster. So you may ask, what is wrong about using just one APS if I have enough memory in the environment? Well, an APS server contains 22 services. And you can imagine in a production environment how difficult would it be to trace a single process if you run into a problem, for example. When one specific service of the APS is giving you trouble, imagine the types of log files that you would get. In addition to that, from a technical perspective, it would be extremely difficult to maintain just one process, one APS process in your cluster. For example, there are considerations of the Java garbage collection that would have to run more frequently to take care of all the 22 services. And that will definitely add overhead to your environment. So the idea here is, what should I do then? Should I keep all of the processes in just one environment? Should I spread them out in different nodes? So the question is, should I scale up? Should I scale out? By scaling up, I mean adding more processes to an existing node. And by scaling out, I mean adding more nodes with more processes in your cluster. Well, scaling up has its own limits. You can't really add a lot more processes on a single node. For example, it's not a good idea to add more web intelligence processing servers on a single node because there will be quite a bit of demand for I/O. You may experience performance degradation. On the other hand, if you have an environment in which you schedule crystal reports mostly at night, it probably should be fine to keep web intelligence processing server processes on the same node for daily processing. If your users access the systems throughout the day, but they interact primarily with web intelligence. Considerations of scaling out nowadays are a lot more simple than they used to be. It's a lot easier today, especially if you have a virtualized environment, to simply add nodes to your cluster and increment the capacity of your environment by creating new nodes with new processes, such as web intelligence servers or crystal reports processing server. What are some of the external roles that affect your environment? One of the important things, and I already alluded to in the system, if not one of the most important, is how well configured your CMS database is. If it is not well configured and if it has high latency, it will have a very detrimental effect to the performance, and it will be noticed by end users. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, considerations of I/O bottleneck, it's very important, and you have to make sure that all the components in your environment, in the cluster itself, such as all the BI servers, or externally, such as the CMS, are well configured and have enough bandwidth to handle I/O. You would be surprised to know how much performance gain you will be able to get by upgrading adjacent systems in your environment, such as if you have an SAP BI environment connected to SAP BW, there are very important upgrades to the SAP BW systems that you can apply that will give you immediate performance gains. And in the case of virtualization, if you have a single host, a single VMware host, for example, hosting 5 or more nodes, you have to ensure that the host itself has enough capacity to handle all the I/O that will be required by all the nodes in the system. What are the roles of maintaining a strategy for your environment? Well, it's important to keep up with all the upgrades of your system. It is probably not a best idea to upgrade every single patch that is available, but it surely is a very good idea
Connect you to the meeting. If you need assistance with your passcode, please contact your host directly to verify the number.
Sorry about that.
All guests have been muted.
So I was saying it's a very good idea to upgrade as soon as support packs are available. The good thing about to keep in mind is the ability to do parallel patching. Starting with the BI 40 SP5, you can now apply patching in parallel. The way this works is you can do all the CMS host servers first. You can upgrade and apply patches to the CMS servers first. And second, you can upgrade or update in parallel all the non-CMS servers, which actually ended up saving you a lot of time. Some of the considerations of the architecture in your system. If you have enough processing power in an environment, you have to make sure that your cluster has enough processing power to handle not only the average load, but also the peak load in your system as well. How do you know if you have enough CPU power? Well, you use the sizing estimator in conjunction with the sizing guide, and you perform stress tests constantly in your environment to simulate loads and to make sure that your system can comfortably handle those loads. You need to evaluate I/O. As I had already mentioned, I/O is very important, and you have to constantly verify that you have enough bandwidth for I/O. Last but not least, you need to make sure that you have enough memory in the environment. Again, memory, you can determine how much you need with the existence of the sizing exercise and the sizing guide. So let's dig deeper into the sizing of BI systems. Well, as I mentioned before, the Sizing Estimator is your biggest friend here in conjunction with the sizing guide. It will give you a lot of information as to what are the limits of the processes, and will give you insights as to how many processes you need in your cluster. In BI 4X, different from previous versions of business intelligence, the sizing is done by SAPs. SAPs stands for SAP Application Performance Standard. SAPs is a performance unit that is hardware independent. And what it really means is it is typically measured in units of 100 SAPs, and it equates to the power of handling 2,000 business order lines item per hour. I give you the URL here for further information on the SAPs. One of the important things is that by sizing your system with SAPs, the greatest thing is that it is completely hardware independent and platform independent. So you can still keep your preferred hardware vendor and make sure that with that vendor you have the SAPs that you need to run your environment. What are some of the challenges of accurately estimating the BI workload? Well, first and foremost, some of the times you can easily underestimate the complexity of an enterprise system. And SAP BI is definitely a high-class enterprise system. If you, by whatever reason, do not follow the recommendations from Sizing Estimator or Sizing Guide, you will most likely get into trouble in terms of performance. It is important to use the BI estimator of SAP BI 4 and not the Quick Sizer or any sizer designed for previous versions of business intelligence. The reason why is because architecturally BI is different and it requires different sizing guidelines. Also, as I mentioned before, always use Sizing Estimator, the sizing guide. It's a very good idea to bring on site a sizing consultant and have all those resources available for your sizing exercise. So what does the new Sizing Estimator look like? Just added a screenshot here to give you an understanding of what it looks like. The important thing here is it is very important to understand the load that your system will have before you deploy your environment. The parameters that you enter into the sizing guide will generate some estimates of your initial sizing. But it's important that you cannot blindly deploy your environment based on those numbers. Those are just initial estimates of what your system should look like. In addition to that, as I mentioned here, you have to run stress tests to really validate the capacity of your system and ensure that the system will be able to handle the loads of average loads or peak loads. Some of the limitations of the Sizing Estimator is that when the Sizing Estimator was created in the SAP labs, most likely the labs did not have the same reports as you have. The number of reports and the complexity were different. And the Sizing Estimator does not account for BW or HANA estimates. So let's look at some of the parameters that you will encounter in the Sizing Estimator. One of the most important parameters of the system is the concept of active users. Active users are all the users who are logged onto the system, sending requests to the system or not. If you don't know how to estimate the active users, a good rule of thumb is to have 10% of your total users. So for example, if you have a system for 10,000 users, you probably should expect around 1,000 active users. There's the concept of active concurrent users. Active concurrent users are logged on users actually sending requests to the system simultaneously. A good rule of thumb is to estimate 10% of active users. So, an example, if you have 1,000 active users, you probably should expect 100 active concurrent users. It's just 10%. As I said, 3% is just a good rule of thumb. But in some systems, you actually going to need more, depending on the distribution of users in your system. If they are business users, if they are experts, and so on. Another parameter of the sizing estimator is the report complexity. So depending on the report that you have, you may need to, the type of report you have and the complexity and how large they are, you might need to have more processes to handle those. For example, the load that a crystal report or web intelligence report pulls into a system is different from that of a dashboard. Another important consideration is that your user groups and workflows are very different size, and it's very difficult to estimate that. You might have users in HR or users in your sales force that requires very different type of workflows, and it's difficult to precisely pinpoint what is the workflow that they use. Another parameter of sizing estimator is the categories of users. So we have three main categories of users. They are the information consumers, who basically post an average of one navigation step every 5 minutes. There are business users, who basically post a navigation step, which actually it's almost sending a request to the environment every 30 seconds. And finally, you have expert users who actually send the request to the system every 10 seconds. So these are very intensive usage of the environment for expert users. I cannot stress enough how important it is to be very familiar with the BI for sizing guide. It is the guide for you to configure the system and have the initial sizing of the environment. If you take a look at that document, you will see things such as what are the limits of a crystal report processing server? How many concurrent active users I can have per process? Should I have more processes in my environment? Should I have more nodes in my environment to handle all the requests? Again, I just posted here the location where you can find the sizing estimator and the sizing guide. So let's talk about testing and tuning your environment. You have to tune your environment once it is installed and has the initial sizing in place for reliability and consistency. Reliability is to ensure that your system is highly available and will include fault tolerance. And consistency means that the system will perform well during average load as well as peak loads. So how do you do that? Well, you install and configure the system using the initial sizing of your environment. You capture vital statistics of your system. You have to constantly monitor the environment. Then you gradually ramp up the number of users in your system and see how that affects the environment. You analyze all the tests, you analyze the metrics, and then you reiterate. You adjust the parameters based on the results that you got. As you ramp up the number of users, you adjust the systems, you reconfigure the processes, you add more nodes, you add more processes if necessary. So how do I know when to scale? Well, a good rule of thumb is to make sure that the average resource utilization in your system is reaching at most 60 to 65%. And I said average load in the system. When the system goes through a peak load, most likely you're going to see somewhere around 80 or 90%. When you start seeing a system going from 60 to 80% of resource utilization, and that start being very constantly, that's a very good indication that it's about time to scale. You're either going to have to add more processes to the environment, or most likely add more nodes to the system. What about memory? What do we do with the memory? With BI4, you have to be very generous with memory. The good thing is that memory is not an expensive resource as it used to be. As I mentioned before, BI4 does use a lot more memory, and this is a direct consequence of its more robust architecture and better performance that you can expect with the system. As I mentioned before, you have to size the system to handle comfortably your max usage, your max load on environment, not only the average. In the process of doing that, from my experience, it's always a good idea to educate your IT department on the requirements that BI will have to perform optimally. How do you test the production environment? Well, testing the production environment entails sizing the system properly, making sure that you run stress tests in the system that will give you a much higher level of confidence as to how the system can perform, what kind of loads it can handle comfortably, and will give you a sense of confidence that your environment will give you a decent response time to your end users, and it will ensure a favorable adoption of the system in your company. And by that I mean a very nice user experience with the system. Because the worst thing you want is your end users to come back to you and say, "I cannot use the system because its performance is not good enough." So one of the things that we use typically is for performance stress test is an HP load runner or attached JMeter. Another thing that you have to be mindful of is that the configuration of the processes that needs to be constantly revised to support the load in your system. And by that I mean, as you run estimates and run the actual load in the system, you always have to keep an eye on how the processes are performing and what's the overall usage or utilization of resources in the system, and constantly adjust that. It's not a one-time exercise you can do and just never revisit anymore. So let's talk about virtualization. Well, virtualization is fully supported by SAP. All SAP BusinessObjects BI products are fully supported for virtualization, which is a very good thing. One important thing to consider here is, even though you can keep on adding nodes to a virtual host, the configuration of the host itself is the responsibility of your IT department. They have to ensure that the host itself has enough horsepower to run all the nodes, has enough I/O capacity to provide enough data stream for all the nodes. which will result in a very good response time to your end users, which is, at the end of the day, that's what you want. I just added a note here that talks about the virtualization. And it's very important as to what systems are fully supported for virtualizations and what virtual systems such as VMware or Hyper-V or Citrix are supported. An important thing about virtualization is that all the instructions that are run for physical servers, or in other words, all the exercise that you've done for sizing systems in physical worlds, in physical servers, can be 100% applicable to virtualized BI systems. There are many tasks that the SAP Co-Innovation Lab ran with virtualizing systems to make sure that it performs on par with physical servers. I've also added a link here for the best practices of running BI for virtualized environments. And if you take a look at this document, you're going to find something really important, which is, as I mentioned, the performance of the overall performance of virtualized systems is pretty much on par with that of physical environments, up to the point of 80% of CPU utilization. I think there is, if I'm not mistaken, there's a slight degradation of performance once the CPU utilization hits 80%. I think this is all well described in the document. Virtualization of specific guidelines. This is extremely important, and I cannot stress enough how important this is. Whenever you set up your system in a virtualized environment, you have to make sure that you have resource reservation. What that means is that every single node, every single SAP BI node hosted in a virtualized environment must have resource reservation. That means is the amount of memory, the number of CPUs, and I/O must be fully reserved to that node. In most environments, I think you have the ability to dynamically assign resource to the node, and that is something that we should not do it. We should not dynamically assign resources to SAP BI nodes. You should define what the resource will be and make sure they don't change. So you should reserve the amount of memory for the nodes, you should reserve the number of CPUs, and it should not be shared with any other enterprise application. It's important, as I said before, it's important to work very closely with your IT department to make sure that they understand that they understand the requirements of the BI system in a virtualized environment, and how important it is to make sure that you have source reservation. So this wraps up the presentation. I wanted to give you a few takeaway points. And so basically the key learning points here are: it's very important to design well your system and to make sure that you go through the entire sizing exercise. What does that mean, to go through the entire sizing exercise? It means to use the Sizing Estimator to have your initial plan for the system. Use the sizing guide to configure the environment and to have an idea as to how many processes you need, how many nodes you're going to add to the cluster. You need to constantly test the system. You need to run stress tests and simulate loads before you open it up, before you go to production. You need to ensure that the system will perform well, not only for the standard load, the standard average daily load in the system, but for peak loads as well. And the only way of doing this is simulating, it's testing, it's constantly adjusting parameters, it's tweaking things, is making sure that every single aspect of your environment is well configured. And I'm not talking about BI only, I'm talking about the web application server, your database, your network, your file system, every single component of the entire system must be well configured and tuned for optimal performance. Because most of the times that I run into performance issues, you have to have this methodic approach and go through the entire landscape and have a very holistic approach of performance. Another important topic, if you are in the process of migrating your business intelligence system from version 3 or XI to BI 4, you have to keep in mind that sizing requirements are different. The system has a different architecture. BI 4 requires new processes that have new resource requirements in terms of CPU and memory. And as a result of that, you get a better system. You get a system that is more robust, a system that is stable, and a system that will satisfy your end user's request. But you have to always work with the Sizing Estimator, Sizing Guide. Strongly recommended to consider bringing on-site a sizing consultant who will walk you through all these steps and will help you run tests and validate capacity and loads in your system. All this is absolutely required. And finally, all the instructions and guidelines that we have discussed here in terms of sizing and best practices for how to configure the environment for optimal performance is valid and applicable for virtualized systems and systems in the cloud. So this wraps up the presentation. I think we still have some time for Q&A.
We have a question from Niranjan. What's the recommendation from SAP on virtualization? I don't know if you want to take that. Or...
Yeah, I can talk about that one. I would strongly recommend you to take a look at the document that I mentioned in the presentation. In the document, you're going to find the results of all the tests that were done by the SAP Co-Innovation Labs, and you're going to see that you can pretty much install your entire system on virtual environments. My experience on site helping clients has been most of the development and test and QA environments for clients who prefer virtualized environments. They tend to install those systems, develop and test QA environments on the virtualized system. And sometimes the production environment they tend to install on physical servers. Most recently, I've seen a lot of clients actually successfully have production environments and virtualized servers as well. What I would suggest is, again, make sure that in that situation, if that's the direction that you want to go with, make sure that you fully simulate the load on those systems. You have to make sure that the host, the VMware or Citrix host that will contain all the SAP nodes has enough horsepower to run your system, will have enough I/O to support all the nodes, and will give you the response time that your end users will want. So again, take a look at the document. But in general, there are not really many differences between a system installed on a physical server and virtual environments. As I mentioned, according to the document and the task, there is a slight degradation of performance once the overall CPU utilization hits 80% or 85%, if I'm not mistaken. But as long as this is just peak performance, you should be fine. If it is average usage of the system, you should most likely think about scaling the system out. But again, the recommendation is test it, simulate it, make sure that you have the numbers, make sure that you have the test in front of you to provide a much greater level of confidence that your system, your production environment in a virtual host will give you not only the performance that you want for average usage, but also for peak usage as well.
Question again from Niranjan. What about sizing for Explorer? Does it cover this in the Sizing Estimator?
No, the Sizing Estimator does not cover this specifically. This specific size estimator does not cover for Explorer. I would say the sizing. If you go to SCN, there's actually I added a link in the presentation, and SCN there's actually a section at the end that talks about sizing, which has links for the sizing estimator that I just mentioned, the sizing guide, and we'll also have links for specific considerations of sizing of Explorer. But yeah, this sizing does not cover Explorer.
Yeah, and Ashish has also put in a different link in the chat window. Question from AJ is, I find VMBI for the one tends to choke when publications because it's very CPU intensive. Do you find that as well?
It depends. It depends how the system is configured. In my experience, I've run into this before, but it was the problem that we had, or the client had, was simply that they had reached the capacity of the system, and we had to scale it out. So what we did, I think we ended up adding more servers, and we ended up adding nodes. We ended up adding nodes fully dedicated to process publications, because the number of publications we had was extremely large. The number of recipients was extremely large. Those were primarily Crystal publications. Once we dedicated resources for the publications, things worked really well. So, and the good thing about this is that some of the times they needed publications in this specific project. The client needed publications sometimes during the day as well, which would impact with the daily load on the system. We ended up dedicating nodes specifically for that, and we created several groups to isolate, and ended up running really well without impacting the existing users on the environment. So it worked out really well.
So a question from Siegfried: does analysis for Microsoft Office affect server performance?
Well, when you run for analysis for, this is not the OLAP, this is the Office. There is communication between the analysis for Office, communication between that tool to the cluster. And if I'm not mistaken, the query might run on the server. I'm not sure about that. I think part of the query, or there's some communication that will run on the server, and you have to account for that in the system. Especially if you have a large number of users, I'll definitely look into that. Oh, okay. So apparently it's saying that they run completely on the client. So yeah, in that case, then yes, they don't affect the server.
So a question from Subian: do these estimation techniques also give the smooth performance for mobile business objects platform?
Primarily, well, for mobile users, this will be a separate category of users, and this is just a separate consumption of resources. you need to keep that in mind because the estimator does not account for that specifically. So you just need to make sure you give a little bit of a cushion room, and then you add that to, you might want to bump it up a little bit in the number of users that you add to the estimator, but it does not account for those users directly.
Yeah, and Merlin and Harjeet have also commented on a couple of aspects in response. So, Shlomo, if you post the links on this chat board, we can click on them and add to favorites. So, if any of the SAP subject matter experts, if there's any documents that you want to post right now, please do so in the chat window. I know that they've also been recorded in Carlos's presentation, which will be available from the SCN page usually within a day or so. So all the links will be there as well. So Siegfried has a question. Is there a best practice for the number of rows in Explorer?
Not that I know of. In terms of limitation, what do you mean by best practice of the number of rows? So I've seen clients really running Explorer against HANA, and you have literally millions of rows, and the performance is spectacular. So there's not really best practice for number of rows. I mean, it really depends on the system that you have and the performance that you want, the response time that you are expecting. But also it depends on your data model that will support that, how well tuned your system is. I would say primarily the data model has a major impact on the amount of information that you want to pull up. As I said, running Explorer against HANA can give you really impressive results.
Yeah, and Ashish has commented, depends on the complexity, similar to you, what you said, Carlos. Seen up to 3 million rows, but some have much lower. From Rohit, recently we have worked with AGS with a limitation on the rows. It does not support more than 20,000 rows. So a counter comment there.
I'm not aware of that limitation, to be honest.
Yeah, so perhaps they can take that offline, and yeah, so Ashish says please follow up with support.
Yeah, as I said, Ashish, my experience has been different. I've run Explorer against HANA, and we definitely had a lot more rows than 20,000.
So I think unless there are no further questions, we will conclude this webinar at this point. And I want to thank everyone for their attendance, and thank you very much, Carlos, for presenting. This webinar recording will be available in a few days from the SCN page that I showed in the chat window. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carlos, and we will conclude this webinar now. Thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you, guys.